Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us. We'll be starting the session in just a couple of minutes as we let people join. All right, well, thank you all for joining us today. We're going to get started. I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar, Readying Southern California Edison's Grid for our EV Future in partnership with ACT News and Southern California Edison, or SCE. My name is Patrick Couch, and I'm Senior Vice President of Technical Services at Gladstein Neandros and Associates, or GNA. During this 1-hour webinar, we'll dive deep into the challenges and opportunities associated with preparing the grid for our EV future. You'll hear firsthand how SCE is readying the electric grid, improving grid resiliency, and learn how fleets and EV charging infrastructure providers can play an active role in this transition. You'll also hear firsthand from Daimler on how an OEM works directly with their fleet customers to plan, build, and scale their charging infrastructure. Now, before we get started, just a few housekeeping items that we want you to keep in mind. The presentation slides from today's webinar will be available to all and sent to all registrants following the webinar. We'll do our best to dedicate as much time as possible to the live Q&A at the end of the webinar, so please submit any questions you have by using the Q&A box located in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. Please direct your questions to the organizer. At the end of the webinar, before closing your browser, we're going to ask that you complete our quick 30-second survey. Please use this opportunity to let us know what topics you would like to see in future webinars. A recording of the webinar will be sent out next week to the email address you used to register. The recording will also be available on the ACT News website. For any technical issues and assistance during the webinar, please email GNA Marketing using the email address you see on your screen. And we'll also drop that email in the chat and we'll quickly assist you with any issues you may have. All right, with that out of the way, we have some great content for you today. You'll be hearing from myself, Mark Esguerra, Director of Distribution System Planning and Strategy at Southern California Edison, Ramiro Lepe, Senior Advisor, Business Development and Partnerships, also with Southern California Edison, and Jed Proctor, Manager of ZEV Infrastructure Concepts and Systems with Daimler Truck North America. Okay, now let's get started. Mark, please take it away.
So thank you, Patrick, and thank you, folks that are on the webinar. As Patrick mentioned, my name is Mark Esguerra. I'm the Director for Edison's Distribution System Planning and Strategy. So we'd want to welcome you here to this event, and some things here just to set the context here. We're definitely seeing, as California continues to move through a lot of its goals and objectives around decarbonization through electricity, Edison is seeing increasing requests for electric service. And we view ourselves, our vision is to lead this transformation of the electric power industry here. So the purpose here that we have for you all in this event is to share some of the activities that we are doing here at SCE in terms of being proactively readying the grid for electrification, not only in the long term, but what are we doing today to be able to help electrify our customers here? As well as we want to use the opportunity here to highlight where there are opportunities where our customers, developers for electrification can play an active role in helping us build out this grid and helping us meet your needs in your electrification plans. So with that, let's go to the next slide. So for some time here, Edison has developed its perspective and laid out its vision on how to achieve a lot of these greenhouse gas goals that are put forward, and through various efforts on how our grid would need to evolve and advance. And so, goes back to the context here of our climate goals here in California, where we set out an objective of being able to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by about 40% from what they were in 1990. And then by 2030, further reducing those emissions by 80%. And along the way, by 2045, achieving net zero GHG emissions for the state. And so in order to accomplish that, if you look in the middle part of the slide, we have published a series of white papers to share our perspective on how to go about achieving these goals here. Some of the papers focus on higher level blueprints, but we've also done our own data-driven analysis on what is needed to achieve these objectives by 2045, which is our most recent white paper here that's in the middle here, Countdown to 2045. We've also looked at aspects of what are some changes that our electric grid would have to undertake, as well as what are some of the policy opportunities called Mind the Gap that we would need to put forward to be able to help achieve these goals here. So there's pathways on how we could achieve it. Definitely the folks that are participating in this webinar are front and center and will be really strong partners in achieving those objectives. Next slide. So what I'm going to get into here is on grid planning and load energization, call it 101. So maybe we'll go to the next slide here. So a lot of our fleets are interested, will the grid be ready? How do we ready the grid? And really we've got to take a step back and inform our customers about what our process is, what are the activities that are involved, because we want to make sure folks are aware of when an application is submitted, what happens here. So when you look at this slide and you start on the very far left-hand side here, you'll see that starts off with the generation aspect, which is the more centralized power plants. But as you move to the right, it gets into our larger portion of our grid. We'll call it our backbone, our grid backbone, that really focuses on the transmission, sub-transmission, and distribution elements. You'll see that there with the pictures in there that depict the different stations that are involved. When you hear about the grid, will the grid be ready? A large emphasis is on what needs to be done to retrofit the grid, to get it ready, plan ahead. And this is where the utilities perform effectively on an annual basis. They look at their grid, project what is the expected growth and demand, what is the plans that our customers have fed us in terms of their plans to grow, and we look out to 10 years, really assessing where are we going to need to expand our grid. Because the reason why we look so further out for this portion of our grid is that infrastructure takes time to develop. And some of the infrastructure we're talking about are longer lead time in nature, cross through multiple jurisdictions, may require licensing, permitting. So really looking out to 10 years, starting those activities in advance will allow us to meet our customers' needs when those needs do arise. And as you move down this journey on this grid planning map, the next aspect of it is probably what most of our fleets are more familiar with, is what we call the load energization or service connection process. And essentially that's when our fleet customers or customers looking to connect to the grid come to us and really are looking to extend a service connection to connect to our grid. So there's really two pieces here, and typically those service connections happen on a shorter time frame, where, as you can see, the grid planning, which is really important, that we look out to 10 years, and it's really important we're getting good information, plans from our customers on where they're planning to expand, even if they're preliminary in nature, so that we can expand I call the backbone of that grid, so to make that be ready and available once you do send an application and seeking for a service connection or load energization. I'll go into those processes here in a little more detail. So next slide. So the first aspect here is we call the distribution planning process, and I referred to it when you refer to the previous slide, that kind of the backbone of the grid. And so most of the connections that we're focused on that connect onto our grid is on the distribution side. And as I mentioned here, we look at our distribution grid every year, multiple times throughout the year, but largely it's an annual process. We look out to 10 years. we forecast where we're expecting the growth and really incorporate that to see how does that impact our system. And so when we start with the forecast development, factoring in projected generation growth, projected customer growth, where are EVs expected, where are customers looking at increasing their power, and then we run our own electrical engineering assessment to understand where are there additional grid requirements in terms of where additional facilities need to be built to be able to serve that load, to be able to deliver it reliably. And then once we identify those requirements, we get into a mitigation option evaluation. Essentially, we review to understand what is the best way to build out the grid to serve those customers to be able to meet their needs. As you can see, it's an iterative process. It goes into our annual plan, and we work with our teams to execute on expanding the grid, that backbone, if you will, to make sure that it can meet the future needs. So on the bottom of this chart, we have a few timelines here just as a feel for some of the upgrades that affect our backbone. So some of the smaller type of upgrades, particularly leveraging existing facilities, but just replacing conductor, increasing the conductor side, minor modifications to our underground facilities, can vary anywhere between a year to 3 years. And that's really depend on the complexity, what type of land and permitting review is required. So that's kind of a smaller size. The medium size upgrades, which is really building new lines that didn't exist before to service customers, larger backbone lines, we call them distribution feeders, or increasing our facility capacity at our substations, large transformers, or even expanding the footprint to add more feeders in the station, could be anywhere between 3 to 5 years. And the larger upgrades where we're basically effectively building a new substation would require licensing in different jurisdictions. And so those require much more coordination and effort, and really starting that process earlier to work through those issues is what's needed. So anywhere between 4 to 6 years. And then some of our larger substations, even larger than our distribution subs, or larger transmission lines that may cross through multiple areas, now we're looking at a much lengthier time frame. So this is why we look out to 10 years and why it's absolutely critical that we get intel and information about our customers' plans to feed it in that process, so that our backbone does not serve as hinders your ability to come online. So we'll leave room for questions on that piece. Next slide. So this next area, this is probably what most of our developers are familiar with. We call our load energization process, our service connection process, and this is where typically the customer will submit an application. As you can see in the process, we'll submit an application, our engineers will review it, they'll do an engineering review, they'll check the backbone of the grid to confirm if there's capacity or not, if grid upgrades are necessary. They'll do the design, and they'll also identify what are all the different service connection requirements to connect that customer's facility to the backbone grid. And then from there, we'll provide that information over to the customer. We call that customer requirements. Typically, there'll be invoices that will be turned over. Contracts will be signed if the customer wants to move forward. And then from there, we schedule and perform the work from the scheduling, construction, and then final accounting. So high level, that's how the process works. Note here the big gray bar that crosses there. So if the backbone grid, if we haven't received information about your plans and it hasn't been reflected in our studies for the longer term, that could trigger an upgrade if there's not enough capacity. So these timelines could get stretched if the backbone of the grid requires investment. So again, even more reinforcement and reasoning why really early engagement with the utility so that we could feed it into our distribution transmission planning process is absolutely key. Next slide. So will the grid be ready? So this is an area that since I've joined SCE, we've very much have been focused on. And so we understand a lot of our customers are still kind of developing their plans. So what we've done is try to do our best to forecast where we believe adoption will occur for a lot of our electric transports that are going to be coming onto the grid. So we've taken some proactive steps. We've actually in addition to our typical 10-year grid planning process that I mentioned, we actually undertook another analysis, really trying to forecast and predict with the best information we had about where we were expecting the electric vehicle growth to occur. And we call that transportation electrification. You'll see the acronym TE. So we undertook what we called a TE grid readiness study, TEGR, and we actually recently filed it in our general rate case, the first of its kind. We deviated away from the state projected forecast of what they were expecting, and we actually projected a more aggressive forecast that is probably more in line with the speed and development and adoption of those policies and what we were seeing our customers doing. So we actually took the state forecast and modified it, and really, looked at what we saw the policies were predicting, the growth we were seeing. So we took a bottoms-up approach. We looked at locations very likely to experience this type of electrification adoption. So we focused it on what are the major freight corridors where we would expect charging, where are the truck stops, where are the distribution centers. Again, using the best information that Edison had. We also sought help from folks outside of the four walls of SCE, other consultants that could also help us understand where we were expecting this growth, the transportation electrification growth to occur. Even partnering with some of the OEMs, as one of my panelists here, Jed, will speak to, we leveraged a lot of information that they provided to help inform where we were expecting to see that growth. And so we took that, modeled that into our system, and performed an assessment. And what you see here on the left-hand side with the map there is just in addition to our typical planning for load growth, when you look at it from a transportation electrification, the incremental, the picture here is showing where are we seeing additional upgrades that's needed to enable that growth. As I mentioned, we included this in our most recent general rate case filing at the CPUC, and we're definitely looking for others to weigh in if we got it right, if we identified the right location. So the green boxes here would be upgrades to our distribution system, and the purple triangles is where the upgrades are impacting the next system higher. So it's a larger capacity need. So it's what we call our sub-transmission system. And so you can see it's really covered about 10 to 15% of our distribution and transmission system, but 90% of the locations that we saw the growth that we were predicting were around major transportation corridors. So, we felt we got it right from that perspective, that the facilities will definitely be utilized and be very beneficial to our fleets. And also, in addition, we also understand that not only the GHG benefits that we're aiming for, but also about 70% of the locations that we've identified happen to also overlap with what we call a disadvantaged community that may have other needs as well. And so by electrifying, we can also help reduce some of the other aspects of the environmental impact for those areas. Next slide. So in addition to planning out the grid and looking out long-term, and you saw the map of where we're proactively looking to get the commission's approval to build, and also need your support for that as well, we're also trying to ready the grid in the near term. So what do we do between now and then? It takes, as we mentioned, it takes years to build some of these upgrades, but what do we do about the fleets that are coming in now? So what we've created is a power service availability action plan. And really there's a couple of aspects of it. Some of it is foundational. We're revisiting our processes internally here at SCE on how we can process these reviews quicker. Are there ways that we could better get visibility into our customer plans than we have today to be able to inform more proactive builds now? Engaging our developers to inform them about our process so that we could reduce the back and forth churn on information that's needed to move forward. We're also looking at how do we get better at forecasting? How do we get better at predicting the impacts to the grid? We're looking at aspects of improving our planning tools. We've improving our hosting capacity maps. We have hosting capacity maps that are put on our public portals for our customers to be aware of available capacity, and we're continuously looking to improve on those. So how do we look at those areas? How do we better prioritize locations of where we build first, and in terms of where the impact will be felt the most? And then we're also looking at different technology solutions. not only are we looking at traditional grid solutions, but we're also looking at, from a near-term perspective, are there some mobile type of solutions that we can deploy to provide as a temporary bridging solution? Also, looking at how does load control, charge management, how can we integrate that as a temporary bridging solution while we're building out our greater grid? And then also from the long term, we're still also got our eye on the long term on trying to address those long-term barriers. Edison's been very active in the space, particularly around looking at how do we streamline some of the lengthy permitting and licensing activities. And so we're proud to say that there's positive movement there. It'll help out in that aspect, but also how do we better coordinate, get in more information from our fleets, working with our local jurisdictions to do more comprehensive, call it master planning, so that we can lay out the grid the way that it needs to be laid out based on the projected needs of the community. Next slide. So with that there, I'd like to hand it off to my partner here, Ramiro.
Thank you so much, Mark, everybody, for joining. So if you could please go to the next slide. So my name is Ramiro Lepe, and I am the Senior Advisor on Southern California Edison's Charge-Ready Transport Program. So what my job pretty much is to do is to work with fleets that are at the beginning stage of the transition to electric. My main goal is to figure out where a fleet is at today, where they want to go, and ultimately help them build a bridge to navigate our various transportation electrification programs that we do offer our customers. So I want to know, like, this is the interactive portion of this particular webinar. I want to know what keeps you up at night in terms of fleet electrification. I know Mark just covered our long-term strategy, our short-term strategy, answer the big elephant in the room. Will the grid be ready? My function here is to really provide you with all the information as to what it is that we offer our customers. So for starters, we'll go here through our tools and programs. So if you're an SE customer, and even some of these you could actually even access if you're not even an SE customer, but we do have various planning tools. So for example, if you want to get an estimate as to how much power is available to your local circuit, the local substation in terms of megawatts for your specific facility, there is a tool that we have that's called a Distribution Resource Plan External Portal. Yes, it is a mouthful, so we call it Dr. Pep for short, but that will give you an estimate of what that is available. If you want to get more of an actual concrete number, we do have an optional capacity study that we do offer our customers as well, where they can actually get the exact amount and even get a strategy as for long-term growth for that 2, 3, 4, even 10-year deployment cycle. The cost of electricity versus diesel, that's always a question that I always get when I interact with fleets as well. How much is going to cost us? If electricity is now my new source of fuel, how much is that compared to what we currently pay for in diesel? So we do have a fleet fuel calculator. Now, the two elements that I really want to dive into today are going to be our transportation advisory electrification services that we do provide, and also our various EV infrastructure installation programs that we do offer. The first one is we have an EV readiness study and a grant writing assistance program. So these are built for people that are at the early stages of the transition, really trying to figure out the feasibility of going electric, and we'll definitely do a deep dive into those, as well as charge-ready transport and Rule 29. Now, I am excited to share with you guys that we do have two programs that are coming online. We have a loan loss reserve program that we're expecting about Q1 of next year. That is going to answer that burning question of residual value. We're going to guarantee a certain percentage of the residual value for customers that are financing their fleet. So hopefully making it easier and more equitable for people to enter the electrification space. The secondary program would be a drayage truck rebate. And to kind of give you an idea, we are giving up to $150,000 per Class 8 tandem axle day cab that is using the drayage operation for customers that are coming into our service area. That should be also online by Q1 of next year. You go to the next slide, please. All right, so let's do a double click. Transportation Electrification Advisory Service. So what is that? We talked a little bit about EV readiness studies. We talked a little bit about grant writing assistance. And a lot of customers that I talk to, they have that question. Well, what is the feasibility of us going electric? What kind of grants are out there? What kind of EVs are on the marketplace? What is the cost of fuel versus that of electricity for my particular use case? These questions and more, we will actually get into massive detail and actually give you a full report, just like what you see there on your screen, that is actually actionable. And the good news is it's free, and you could get it in your inbox in less than a month. And that's for beginning when you actually set up the appointment. The time that we do the analysis with you is about an hour-long conversation, and then we do present you with this particular report that you could utilize for your planning purposes. Now, the natural line of progression is, well, this is all great, it's feasible, but how are we going to pay for these EVs? So the question of funding comes into play. So we do have what we call a grant writing assistance program. So we did partner up with G&A, so Glassini Anderson Associates. And the way that it works is we actually pay G&A on the customer's behalf to either write or review a package for programs like Carl Moyer or Volkswagen mitigation. So to the fleet operators that are on this call, if you have an actual truck that is available for scrap, these may be two great options. And the good thing about it is stackable for the drayage truck rebate program. So it's another conversation we can also get into on a one-on-one. All right, guys, next slide, please. All right, so let's talk about infrastructure installation pathways. So we talked about the EV readiness study, possibly how we can help you offset the cost of electrification of a tandem axle day cab or any sort of electric vehicle that you might be looking at, say class 2 or higher. Now let's go into the infrastructure piece of it, right? So how are we going to get charging stations built at our facilities? Or maybe you're an entity that wants to install public charging arrays, and how do we navigate the infrastructure installation program for those elements? Now we have two very distinct tracks, and some customers are able to go one route or another. So that would involve an in-depth conversation to figure out what's best for you. And other customers, we already know just coming into it that charge-ready transport might be the best option, or if there's no EV acquisition plan, Rule 29 might be the better option, but you might be wondering what is the difference between both. So we'll do a really high hour-long presentation in 2 minutes. We'll give it to you here. But charge-ready transport, what it is what we call a low to no cost EV infrastructure installation program. So if I can direct you over to the left of our screen, you'll see that in charge-ready transport, we're going to do distribution up until the meter upgrades. That's part of the program. And then we're going to give you two different construction tracks on your side of the meter infrastructure installation. The first one will be called the SCE build, where we come all the way up to your side of the property, install all the panels, do all the trenching, all the wiring, all the way up to the first point of interconnection between the charging station and the physical infrastructure. So under that particular scenario, you would only be responsible for the purchase of the EV, the charging station, installation of the charging station. We cover everything else. Permitting, designing, construction, all those elements are covered through the program. Now, let's say you say, well, this is all great, but we want to install what I call some advanced bells and whistles. You want to install some distributed energy resource. You want solar, you want a microgrid, you want a turbine, or what have you, any kind of technology coming out, even V2G technology. You can incorporate that in charge-ready transport utilizing what we call the customer-built option. So under customer-built option, we will still do all the utility side from distribution up into the meter, with the difference that anything on your side of the meter would be responsibility of the customer, utilizing IBEW unit labor, but that does give you the option, but not the obligation, to install DERs at a future date. Now, one of the great things about that side of the program is that we do offer an up to 80% project cost rebate. Now, on the other angle, I can tell you, charge-ready transport does require an EV acquisition. So for every one vehicle that you purchase, you are allotted one charging port as part of the program, and there is a one-to-one requirement with a minimum of 2 vehicles acquired to enter the program. It does also have a special approved product list for the charging stations. So your charging array would have to be on Edison's approved product list, and then at that point, then you'd be able to enter that program. Now, let's say you're thinking to yourself, well, this is all great, but we're not purchasing EVs. What can we do then? Or maybe you're building out some charging as a service where there's no EV acquisition. So there is what we call the optional tariff, Rule 29, which is on the right side of your screen now. Rule 29 will still cover distribution up until the meter upgrades. Anything downstream of the meter would be responsibility of the customer. There are no rebates on that side of it, but one of the advantages I can tell you is that on that point, there's no EV acquisition requirement, no charger APL requirement. Now, if we do some pros and cons, one thing I tell you, charge-ready transport is a 10-year program participation agreement. Rule 29 is a 5-year agreement. Once again, charge-ready transport does have an EV acquisition requirement, an APL requirement, whereas Rule 29 does not have that. Charge-ready transport does have an IBEW union labor requirement, whereas Rule 29 does not. So there's a couple different variances to both programs. But one thing that they do share is that they are separately metered projects, and they would be actually injected with special commercial time of use EV only rates. So currently we do have a tariff, a rate tariff called EV TOU 7, 8, or 9. So depending on your usage, you'd be able to enter, any one of those particular tariffs or go into like a general service rate should you choose to do so. Now, as a full disclosure, you cannot have dual participation. So if you have a project that is already gone through charge-ready transport, you would not be able to incorporate a Rule 29 element. So there's definitely a lot that goes into all this, and we could definitely help you on a one-on-one and cover both of these. Now let's go to the next slide. Now, one of the questions you might be wondering is, well, how long does this all take? What's the infrastructure timeline look like, right? That's always a question I get. Well, one thing I want to disclose to you, and this is the part of the program where you might want to screenshot this. Every EV charging infrastructure project is a major construction project. If you take anything away what I say, just know that. You got to plan up front. And we identified the top 6 culprits, if you will, as to what might pop up in your particular EV project. Now, before you even get to Edison, there's a lot of pre-planning. I know Jet's going to talk a little bit about that. But there's a lot of planning involved, right? So you got to choose your EV, you got to choose your charger selection, you got to look at your site plan, and all these other elements that come into play. And then once you hit the program, there's a bunch of things that could pop up. So the type of project, is it a make-ready or utility infrastructure only? So I mentioned in charge retransport, we give you both options. Well, let's say you chose the SCE build because we do everything. Well, it's going to take a little bit longer because now we're having to do all the designs, getting all your permits, securing the materials, completing construction on both sides of the meter, and that can take a little bit of time. And then there's the specific site characteristics, and this is a big one because there's a lot of things that can happen where people don't really think about. And before I started working at it, I would have never even thought of this, right? So there's environmental remediation. There's an existing, utilities that might be on site, so like natural gas or gasoline lines, or you have to be certain encroachment away from those facilities. Or does the electric service already exist? Or to Mark's point earlier, are we gonna have to build new infrastructure to build that circuit line in? So these are elements that we have to plan for up front. Now, in terms of capacity, does capacity exist? Is there enough power to your location? Or will we need to add that service to actually service your project? So some projects will require additional capacity to be brought in, and that, of course, once again, can add time. Permits and clearances, this is a big one. So right now, we have to get permission. A lot of people don't realize this. We have to get permission from what we call the area having jurisdiction. And think of we call it AHJ. Think of that as like your city, your county, your cities, any of those entities. They actually have to give us permission to be able to build on your facility. If you're going through a charge retransport or Road 29 project or any infrastructure installation project for that matter. So for that, there has been scenarios where there is delays in getting those permits. And in some cases, some of these scenarios do delay the project by several months. So something to definitely talk to your area having jurisdiction up front, letting them know of your intent beforehand so that we could try to mitigate any problems in the back end. Now, another big one, big elephant in the room is some people on this call that may be experiencing some material and equipment, actual timeline delays right now, right? So I can tell you, key materials and equipment needed to complete EV charging infrastructure projects such as switch gears, some transformers, some possible utility infrastructure updates, those do take a while. Now, I always tell everybody the easy part, and Jet can talk a lot more about this, is getting the truck, right? I'm sure like most manufacturers, they might have it sitting on the lot today, or you might have it in 5-6 months, but it's everything else that takes a lot longer to get. That's the harder part. And then there's the customer engagement. So I kind of compare it to like throwing a football, right? So like in the beginning, the first part is the application, which we'll go into some of the requirements that we look for. But then it's also like, depending on the project itself, is the customer bringing utility designs to us, providing clearances, signing agreements, signing off of easements, getting landlord involvement, right? There's all these elements that come into play. So the one thing that I always stress is that early engagement is going to help you mitigate some of these issues that you might go through. Next slide, please. So how early should customers engage with SCE, right? So this is the question I get all the time. We'll go to the next slide now. And really, you want to give yourself as much runtime as possible. But what we did is we actually came up with a couple different scenarios for you. And just keep in mind that every single project is complex and different. Even if you're, for example, like on the same facility, you're building in the east side of the facility, and you're going to build in the northwest side of the facility, those are two completely separate projects. Are going to have completely different timelines. So that's just a word of caution. So any size project, doesn't matter what it is, we always talk about that early utility engagement, no lesser of 2 years. That is my recommendation. If you're looking at a 3 to 10 megawatt project, no lesser of 3 years. And anything that's 10 to 15 megawatts, you want to, no less than 5 years. You want to definitely let us know ahead of time. And one of the strategies that we look at, for example, with charge ready transport, we can look up to your 10-year deployment strategy. And we look at the phased in approach here. So we will try to figure out what can we do in the short term. Let's say, for example, you want to buy a fleet of 110 max day cabs over the next 10 years, 10 every year for the next 10 years. We could technically deploy the entire infrastructure to a program like charge ready transport up front. And as long as you purchase and install the chargers up front and put these vehicles onto an agreement, then what we would do is we would bring in a phase in approach of power. So as you're bringing in vehicles, our strategy would be to phase in power to meet your true demand point. So that's why, once again, this early engagement is key. And there is some emails there at the bottom, but at the end of this presentation, I'm going to give you a QR code that you can scan, so get yourself all ready, and my personal contact information. So that way you don't have to navigate through all these emails. I will help you with it personally. Next slide, please. Now, let me tell you guys one thing. There is a misconception in the marketplace, especially with fleets, and I come from the fleet world, where fleets think, or the industry believes, that we know where you park your vehicles. And the reality is that we don't. We spend lots and lots of money on modeling and different data reports and telematics systems, and we work with individuals like Daimler to get us some of these reports. But there is no substitute for having your plans. And what we're literally doing with these plans, and mind you, it doesn't have to be like, oh, this is exactly what we're doing. You know, it could just be like, here's our fleet, here's where we park, here's our location, something as easy as that. Or say, no, I mean, we're actually gonna get 100 vehicles over the next 10 years, and here's our deployment cycle and what it looks like. And it's likely that you're probably not in the latter, but even helping us to some degree as to where you park your vehicles will help validate the research that we're doing. And ultimately, it helps us actually drive investment into the areas where we know the load growth is going to occur. So we don't want to just, get a map and throw a dart at it and say, okay, we're going to throw some infrastructure there. We actually have a methodical approach that we take. So your engagement is key. So if you go to take a minute, scan this QR code and just let us know your plans. And mind you, it doesn't even have to be anything solidified. It could be an estimate that is literally going to help us help you in the long term. Now, as a full disclosure, this is not a silver bullet, right? And if we go to the next slide, there is this engagement that we always call that, engage with the utility early, engage with us often. But what does that really mean, right? It's not just that initial deployment. We actually want to look downstream as far as possible as we possibly can and establish a relationship with you. And if you see here, for example, the way that our programs are structured, we literally have something at every stage of your journey. So in the beginning of this conversation, I started off by saying that I want to identify where you're at today, where do you want to go, and my job is to help you build the bridges to how to get there. I do that through the series of these programs that we do offer you. So take advantage of these programs. There's no fee for any of our programs. And if we go to the next slide, one thing I will urge is that you do set up a one-on-one consultation with us. There's definitely a lot that we just covered here, but I want to personally give you my information. So if you have any questions, you want to figure out how to navigate the utility process, Jasmine, please go to the next slide. This QR code that you're about to pop up right here, there we go. Pull yourself on, screenshot this, reach out to me personally. I will help you navigate through the utility infrastructure installation process. Thank you guys. Back to you, Patrick.
Thanks, Ramiro. That's fantastic. And I think we have done a very good job getting the idea of early and often as when you should reach out to your utility and to the zeitgeist of EV and electrification professionals. But I think this is one of the clearest sort of explanations of the value and benefit of engaging early and what the evolution of that engagement might look like from the early planning and long-term forecasting into actually preparing for new load and new service. And I was really sort of impressed to learn about this effort that Jed's going to talk to us about, that him and his team at Daimler Trucks took on to sort of proactively contribute to that understanding of where load might occur, and of course all the additional services that they provide for their customers to help navigate them through the process. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and switch over to Jed Proctor, Manager ZEV Infrastructure Concepts and Solutions at Daimler Trucks, to share his story with us.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. Happy to be here. Thanks for GNA for hosting, and thank you to SCE, who we really consider a partner in this journey to electrification across heavy-duty transportation. Daimler and SCE have been engaged for the last several years to help our industry, navigate new technologies coming to the market. In fact, we actually meet pretty regularly, at least once a month, to discuss, upcoming industry requirements, et cetera. But also, we even get down to the fleet level and discuss fleet implementations of Freightliner and Daimler vehicles straight. Every month we really sit down and talk about each individual deployment and how it's going. And SCE has really come to the table as a partner, and we're happy to be here to help get the message out that the utility is critical in this journey. So if you can pull the next slide, please. First, let's talk about kind of the big elephant in the room, right? There is regulation and mandates coming to the California market. I don't need to read into too many of the exact details of this slide, but the message really here is there are requirements coming from both us as manufacturers and U.S. fleets that require a transition to zero-emission vehicles. The funding required for that is going to be extensive. We've got some numbers on the screen here. These are our Daimler internal estimations of what this type of transition could cost, both for charging infrastructure equipment that would be purchased by station operators, public charging sites, or private charging facilities at the fleets. We've got some capacity estimations and some some funding estimations on the grid side. But again, the key message that I want to get across here is that if we look at the state of changes in our industry in the past, this one is coming faster than anything we've ever experienced before, and that's going to require us as an entire industry to come together, to share information, and to help the utilities, other fleet partners really understand where the load is going to be, so that we can make this transition smoothly and keep freight moving along corridors for the American populace. So next slide. So, you know, I guess it's been a couple years now. We were kind of trying to brainstorm and figure out what we could do to help. And we realized that we actually have a plethora of data coming off of our connected vehicles. And we decided to kind of take this data and put it in some useful and meaningful ways. I want to tell you guys that we've completely anonymized the data. There is no customer specific data here. But what we've done is we've basically said, where do trucks live? You know, registration records aren't helpful. Trucks are registered, you know, wherever it's convenient for the fleet for them to be registered. But where they live, where they park on a regular basis, where is their kind of home every night location for those pickup and delivery opportunities? That's where we wanted to kind of aggregate, anonymize this data and be able to share it with utilities. So we approached SCE as one of the first utilities that said, hey, would this be useful to you? And could this help in your capacity planning? And overwhelmingly, they gave us the feedback that, yeah, absolutely. So as we look at transitioning to zero emissions vehicles and electric vehicles specifically, this is data that we are bringing to the utilities to show them where vehicles park and where the future load, as those vehicles transition to electric, will need to be. You can see this little snapshot is actually not even from California, it's from Oregon. It's from right down the street from our corporate headquarters here in Portland, Oregon. If you can transition to the next slide, please. A few more examples here, but kind of the big one is Ontario, Rancho Cucamonga area. This is referred to as the Inland Empire. I'm sure a lot of you guys are familiar with this location. A lot of the freight that comes out of the Port of Long Beach and Los Angeles transitions into this warehouse location. And it's pretty easy to drive down and through this location and be like, yeah, there's a lot of trucks here. We should probably plan for some load. What we're able to do with this data is help SCE underestimate the magnitude and the timing that load will need to come on, so that they can start to build large transmission lines and make sure the grid is, you know, has enough capacity in that area when US customers start contacting them and saying, hey, I'm going to need load at this particular facility. Hopefully this gives them a heads up at the ability to start building that core backbone infrastructure earlier than they otherwise could because of this information. I would say that this is not, they need more than this information, and that's really what Ramiro was talking about. So I would encourage everybody here to go ahead and use the QR code, fill out the survey. Even if your plans aren't sure, at least tell us where those trucks are sitting, where they're operating. Because again, this is one data point. We think it's pretty accurate for the fleet of vehicles that are linked to telematics that are Freightliner vehicles. But the more data that SCE can gather, the more information they'll have to do their planning to ensure that the grid actually is ready as we move forward. Next slide. So just in closing, you know, we like to think a lot about the transition as a formula. It's really a multiplication formula. We need the right products, and Daimler, as well as the other OEMs in the industry, are working really hard and investing a lot of money to bring these solutions to market, viable product solutions that can do the jobs that are required of our industry to move freight. We're also working really, really hard to get those costs down. There's also incentive programs that can help fill the gap to get to that total cost of ownership parity to operate these vehicles, knowing that the fleets, you know, still need to operate in a financially wise manner. And the third piece of this formula is really the infrastructure. And that's where we're asking you to reach out to your utility, really communicate early and often, help us understand and help the utilities understand where the load needs to be so that they can pre-plan and get the load there in the time that you need. And we say this is a multiplication formula because if any one of these items are zero, nothing works, right? If we don't have infrastructure, we could have the best trucks at super low cost, but if you can't charge them, it doesn't work, right? And so all of these pieces have to come into play. And again, want to thank SCE for all the good hard work they're doing up front, and really encourage you to continue to reach out to your utilities, even if you're not in SCE. This is applicable across the United States. Reach out to your utility, help us. If you're not in SCE territory, is one pitch I'll give you. If you reach out to your Daimler representative or myself, we have contacts with most of the major utilities. We're happy to connect you to the right partner. And with that, I'll hand it over to Patrick.
Great, thanks, Jed. Before I let you go and get into the sort of normal course of business here, we got one quick question, which was, what do the dots, the colored dots on your slide mean?
Oh yeah, so those are just the magnitude in each location of like how many vehicles are there. So what we did is we basically triangulated a bunch of data. We said, okay, where do trucks park? How long are they parked for? And then immediately after they leave that location, how many miles do they drive? And that gives us an estimation of, if they were charging there, how much energy would they have to onboard at that location in order to do their next job. And so the size of those circles really indicate the larger the circle, the more power is needed at a specific location, right? So that's really kind of the math that we did to say, how can we estimate in a specific location how much load would need to be there?
All right, thank you very much, Jed. So we're going to shift into the rest of our Q&A session. We'll be answering questions that you've submitted throughout the webinar, and don't stop. Please continue to submit your questions and we'll get to as many as we can. Before we do, I just want to quickly remind you again that the slides from today's webinar will be available and sent to all webinar registrants. We'll also be dropping in contact information for each utility representative into the webinar chat and sharing that on screen so that you have all the resources you need to connect with your utility today. All right, so let's go ahead and dive into the Q&A. So one thing that I think is on a lot of folks' minds is the impact and need that's going to be created by the Advanced Clean Fleets and Advanced Clean Trucks regulations. And so I was wondering, maybe this is a question for you, Ramiro, or Mark. What are you guys doing to make sure that SCE is going to be able to guarantee that fleets can meet those ACF requirements and timelines?
Yeah, I can start off, Ramiro, and then you could weigh in addition. So some things that we're doing, I think the really key message that we want to leave behind is we'd like to engage and get your information as early as often so that we can feed it into our planning process to actually develop that infrastructure that's needed. As you saw in my presentation, really the grid, there's a couple components. There's what we call the backbone. When you hear the grid, that's kind of the larger grid, and typically upgrading those pieces on the grid takes time depending on the size of the need. And so really feeding into that process is probably really key. So really engaging early and often. The other thing I will also mention is SCE has done one of the first of the California utilities actually deviated away from the state forecast of what's expected for electrification. Actually, we are actually forecasting a more aggressive adoption happening earlier, and we've actually put forward our case with the California Public Utilities Commission to allow us to proactively build. So making sure folks are aware of that there. If they're interested in supporting SCE in any way in that rate case to be either a party or to provide comments, I urge them to do so, to help the utilities really get support to proactively build in advance. Ramiro?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. I would add, aside from this angle, one of the things that we're really big on is that fleet utility interaction. So it's not uncommon for me to reach out to fleets, cold calling, right? I mean, this one of the scenarios, we're part of various trucking associations like Harbor Trucking Association. We have industry segmented fleet electrification workshops. Give you an idea. Yesterday we had one for telecoms. Today we're having one for cities and counties. If you look at the way the ACF regulation is structured, those are on two different sides of it. One's a high priority fleet, one's going to fall into the state and local government fleets. So we understand that each industry segment has specific questions, has specific challenges, has specific EV requirements, or some that don't even exist in the marketplace, right? And even with the Edison fleet, we're finding some of that as well. So how do you mitigate that? And really being able to deep dive into a customer's current scenario and answering their questions specifically to their fleet composition. A lot of us on the team come from a fleet background, including myself, and that really does help with the conversation. We've also partnered up with G&A to come up with an ACF fact sheet. So we are giving out as much information to the fleets, letting them know, like, this is how you properly prepare. Now, mind you, we're not regulation experts by no means, but we do our best to make sure that we tie into industry with CARB, with the regulation, and provide solutions that make sense for our customers.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. I'd like to maybe continue, Ramiro, with you for a second here. I think you touched on this a little bit, but how is the SE process different, and what are the different sort of options for fleets or for developers who are building things like public charging or truck as a service?
I think with developers, trucking as a service can come in two different models, right? We've seen some scenarios where trucking as a service involves a truck acquisition. So it's a full service where they provide the EV, they provide the charging array, the insurance, location. So it's pretty much an operator comes in, they pay X amount of dollars a month, they get a vehicle, it has all the services. Or we've seen charging as a service providers where they're literally leasing out the space, right? Whether that's, you know, by day or every other day. I'm not sure exactly how they do all those elements of it. So our programs are designed depending on the structure of the deal, if you will, right? So a trucking as a service model where there is an EV acquisition, it's a likelihood that most times, 9 times out of 10, they're going to try to go with charge-free transport because there is more benefits to the customer inside of, customer side infrastructure build outs, rebates potentially on the chargers, a lot of different benefits. Whereas Rule 29 is going to be distribution up into the meter upgrades, but it does give the flexibility of the customer not having to purchase fleet, because not all of these entities are in the business of wanting to own fleet. So that is going to be the biggest differentiator. So whenever we do talk to a customer, we take a holistic approach, really understanding what the ultimate fleet needs are for them or their ultimate charging needs and what their business model is. And based on that, we will actually derive a solution based on the questions that we ask them. It might be easement related, it might be time frame related, it could be that EV acquisition plan, or they want to install some chargers that are not necessarily on our Edison product list. These are elements that will sway it over to a Rule 29 project. So definitely taking each project holistically, because once again, they're all different, everything's so different. And that's the approach that we take with every single customer. So if you get a call with me, we're literally going to do a deep dive into your specific scenario.
Great. And there's a few questions received that are all kind of pointing to the same theme. And the theme there is that the utility grid is being asked to do a lot more than just transportation electrification in a vacuum, right? We have renewable energy integration, we have building electrification, we have a lot of new and evolving demands for the grid. And Jed, I was wondering, maybe at least, I know your expertise is on the commercial transportation side. Can you maybe put some of the expected increased generation and energy demands for transportation electrification in context for us?
Yeah, sure. So we did a lot of work to figure out if we were to electrify every freight mile in the United States, what would that add to the electricity needs in the U.S.? It's around 15%. If we were to take every commercial vehicle mile operated today, we'd need about 15% more capacity on the grid. We actually did a little bit more work and looked at pass car, and it's about another 15%. So with passenger car plus commercial vehicle, every road mile traveled in the U.S. across all classes of vehicles, you're looking at about a 30% increase in total energy demand. And now that's going to happen over a long period of time, right? That's going to happen over 20, 30. I mean, pick number of years, but it's not. We're not going to flip a switch overnight, obviously, right? So at least our point of view, and I'd be interested in Mark's point of view from a capacity planning perspective here as well. From our point of view, is the actual amount of energy on the grid, a 30% increase over 30 years doesn't sound that insurmountable. But really, the question is where. And when we get into transportation electrification, especially heavy fleets, where we see large concentrations of lots of vehicles that will have humongous battery capacities, all needing to be charged at the same time? That's the key question that we need to unlock as an industry, and that's what we're asking for today, right? Because adding a passenger car at every address is one thing. That's pretty broadly based, distributed over an entire network. But when we say we're going to have 1,000 port vehicles all needing to be charged near the port at the same time, that's a completely different story. And I think that what it really comes down to, especially for transportation, and this is where commercial vehicles are specifically different, and that's why we need this data, is the where is really important. I'll let Mark chime in on this as well. But I think over the long term, I think we'll be able to produce enough energy. The question is do we know where it's going to be, and can we get the energy where it needs to be when the vehicles show up?
All right, and Mark, I definitely want you to respond to Jed as well, but I want to load on top of that a question, right? And the question kind of relates here, which is, as these projects are being developed, we're seeing not only new load, but new generation, right? We're seeing some projects built with DER, others just coming in and adding new solar, wind generation to the mix. So thinking about these increasing generation needs, is SE able to streamline or somehow guide customers through how to interconnect those different loads at the same time?
Yeah, that's a great question. I will first start off by just making a comment. It is a fantastic, exciting time to be a grid engineer, because these are the type of problems that a lot of our engineers are really, really excited to solve and deal with. And the volumes are really massive. So I will tell you, just if you look back at our looking at our distributed generation portfolio for behind the meter solar in California, for the entire state, it's roughly about 14 gigawatts just behind the meter rooftop type solar. So we've interconnected a lot, and we've done it with innovation in our processes. We've done it with partnering with the technology industry, the inverter manufacturers, the solar installers. And I see us continue to do that. When you look out to 2045, in fact, we published a white paper, as I mentioned, Countdown to 2045. We are expecting on the generation front, at least on the distributed front, that it's going to more than double what we have now. And then when you look at it from a distributed energy storage front, we actually are expecting it to be 10 times what we have now. We're actually seeing the growth of distributed energy storage start to take off. And if you look at the statistics in California, a lot of it's centered here in Southern California. So a lot of work's been done. I think there's going to be more work, more exciting work to streamline those processes on how to integrate those packages, because you're looking at the system delivering power to the grid. We're also looking at the system taking power to store for later on. So a lot of work that's going on there. We're leveraging technologies to find ways to streamline and automate that process. So definitely one. Then the other aspect is, from the growth perspective on the capacity side. Another white paper we've published, and it's also on the slides, reimagining the grid, where Edison's kind of looked beyond kind of the current grid designs and seeing this very distributed grid, very highly dependent from the economy, from our customers, being able to support electric vehicles, export heat pumps in the home, as well as the freight and other services. So we are also looking at beyond the traditional solutions we have today, which we're working with our commission to allow to proactively build, but we have teams that are continuously looking at what does the next grid design need to be able to further, I call it, build large capacity on a smaller footprint while being as efficient as possible. So a lot of activity in that space, a very exciting time, and definitely more to come, and SE is glad to share our progress in that space.
Great, thank you, Mark. Ramiro, I'm going to give you the last word here, and then we're gonna wrap up for folks. But one question, sort of again in the theme of coming at this challenge from a lot of different angles. You mentioned a loan loss reserve program, and I think that piques some folks' interest. So could you maybe explain a little bit how that's going to work?
Yeah, so loan loss reserve program, it's about to hit the industry, I would say Q1 of next year. So what it is, it's a pool of money where we're going to reserve specifically for the residual value of an EV. So right now when somebody goes to finance even a diesel truck, if they're credit challenged, they're going to have higher rates, higher payments, or might not even be able to get in without a significant amount of down payment. So the idea behind it is to guarantee a percentage of that potential loss. And that, because right now one of the questions we're seeing with the finance entities is that they don't necessarily know what a tandem axle day cab will be worth that's electric at 500,000 miles, 8 years from now, as an example, right? Because we haven't got there yet. So these are some of the elements that we're looking at seeing how can we make financing, well, the transition to electric more equitable for everybody. So that is one of the reasons why we have this program, with the idea of making sure that we are able to guarantee a certain percentage of that residual value so that entities could come in and actually have an easier time, if you will, getting approved for their credit lines.
Great. Thank you, Ramiro. Appreciate that. All right, everyone, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much for joining us. You'll receive a follow-up email shortly, including a recording of this webinar, along with the presentation slides you saw today. The recording will also be posted to the ACT News website. As a reminder, please fill out the quick 30-second survey that will pop up as you leave the webinar. Again, thanks so much for joining us. Please enjoy the rest of your week and take care.